Good evening and welcome. I'm Madeline Rosenberg, the Public Humanities Specialist here at the Princeton Public Library. It's my pleasure to host tonight's program, which is presented in partnership with Princeton University Press and with support from the National Endowment for the Humanities. Tonight, we will hear from Nancy Foner in conversation with Alan M. Kraut about her new book, One Quarter of the Nation, Immigration and the Transformation of America. Following a brief presentation by Professor Foner, she will be joined in conversation by Professor Kraut. There will be an opportunity to ask the speakers questions at the end of the program. Nancy Foner is Distinguished Professor of Sociology at Hunter College and the Graduate Center, City University of New York. Her many books include Strangers No More with Princeton University Press, In a New Land with NYU Press, and From Ellis Island to JFK with Yale University Press. Alan M. Kraut is Distinguished Professor of History at American University and a non-resident fellow of the Migration Policy Institute. His many books include The Huddled Masses, The Immigrant in American Society, 1880 to 1921, Wiley Blackwell, and Ethnic Historians in the Mainstream, Shaping America's Immigration Story with Rutgers University Press. Dr. Kraut is a past president of the Organization of American Historians and serves as the current president of the National Coalition for History, chair of the History Advisory Committee of the Statue of Liberty Ellis Island Foundation, and an elected fellow of the Society of American Historians. In 2017, he received the Lifetime Achievement Award from the Immigration and the Ethnic History Society. So I see more are trickling in, and I'm just going to go over a few housekeeping items before I turn things over to our speakers. We recommend that you use the Zoom app instead of the browser-based version of Zoom if you're able. Please note that this event is being recorded. Recordings are typically uploaded onto the library's YouTube channel a few weeks after the event. Live transcription is enabled for this program. You can turn it on and off via a button at the bottom of your Zoom window. If you have comments during the program, please enter them in the chat box. If you have a question, however, that you would like the speakers to potentially address at the end of the program, we ask that you put it in the little Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. If you're using a mobile device, this function may be in the top right corner of your screen. Finally, if you're interested in purchasing the book, it's available at Labyrinth Books. We'll try to put a link in the chat. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Nancy Foner to the virtual stage.
I did it. Thank you so much, Madeline, for that introduction. And thank you also for organizing this event and the other people at the library the same. And also thanks to Alan Kraut for being willing to be here and have this conversation about my book. So what I want to do to begin the event tonight is just to lay out very briefly the main themes and give a quick overview of the book. And the book focuses, as you've heard, on immigrants' impact on this country. And that has become so much a part of daily life that we sometimes fail to see it. And that's deceptive because the changes in the years since 1965 have been far-reaching and profound. In fact, it's fair to say that they've transformed large portions of our institutions and our culture. The numbers alone are extraordinary, and I say them all the time, and every time I say them, I think they're extraordinary. By 2020, an unprecedented 45 million immigrants were living in the US, the largest number since census records have been kept. Together with their children, they totaled 86 million, accounting for 26% of the nation's population, more than 1/4 of the country, and that is where I got the title of the book from. It's the equivalent of absorbing the entire population of Germany and then some. Up to now, however, much of the discussion of contemporary immigration's impact has focused on how it's changed the lives of immigrants. And in fact, most of my work in my career has focused on the impact of immigration on the immigrants themselves and their children. But I take a different approach in this book, focusing on how immigration has transformed American society and culture, giving a big picture view through a national perspective and examining a number of key economic, social, and cultural domains. So let me start with race. Few things have changed this country's racial picture more conspicuously than the last 50 years of immigration. For much of the 20th century, race was mainly a matter of Black and white. If we go back to 1960, which is 5 years before the 1965 Immigration Act, had such a huge impact in changing the immigration flows to this country. If we go back to 1960, fully 85% of Americans were white. When most Americans thought of minorities, they had Black people in mind. Hispanics, this is in 1960, were a mere 3.5% of the population, and Asian Americans were barely visible at less than 1%. Today, whites, non-Hispanic whites alone, have shrunk to around 60% of the population. Hispanics at 19% are now the largest minority group, and Asian Americans are now about 6%, while about the same percent are Black today as in 1960. Almost a tenth of Black people in America are immigrants, with the overwhelming majority from Africa and the Caribbean. And this in turn has led to astonishing changes in the composition of some of our largest cities. Even cities that already had substantial Hispanic populations, the numbers have exploded in the last half century owing to immigration and to births. The city of Los Angeles, just to give one example, went from less than 10% Hispanic in 1960 to nearly half in 2019. Miami-Dade County is in a class all by itself. It's become a Latino global metropolitan giant. In 2019, Miami-Dade County was 69% Hispanic, up from 5% in 1960. Altogether, in US central cities, so that's all central cities in the US, by 2010, nearly a quarter of the residents were Hispanic, and that's up from 3% in 1970. And the proportion of Hispanics in the suburbs has mushroomed as well. In the South, the old Black-white binary is being altered by growing Hispanic as well as Asian inflows. Asian Americans have not only grown by leaps and bounds in cities like New York and Los Angeles with their old historic Chinatowns, although they were relatively small in population, but Asian Americans have multiplied in areas where they were hardly present half a century ago. Houston, for example, Las Vegas, and Minneapolis, just to name three. Also striking is the decline of all white neighborhoods in metropolitan areas, a development in which immigration has played a significant role. In a study, a demographic study of neighborhoods in 24 highly diverse metropolitan areas, and the study was done in the year 2000, only a quarter of the more than 1,200 neighborhoods that had been all white in 1980 can remain all white in 2000. And this is not just because a few minorities moved in. These are neighborhoods by and large with substantial numbers of Hispanics and Asians. Immigration has also had a role in the big growth in mixed marriages, since a great many involve second-generation Hispanics and Asian Americans, who in addition are producing a growing number of multiracial children. And by the way, when I say second generation, I mean the US-born children of immigrants. Immigration has not only created a new demographic reality, but it's also altered how Americans think about race. East Asians, once considered the yellow peril in a common popular view, now in another common popular view, have become the model minority, just even though as spiking hate crimes during the pandemic remind us, they are still subject to racial prejudice and discrimination. Immigration has changed the very words we use to talk about race. The very category Hispanic is a modern day invention, rarely used 50 years ago, and I should say only put on the census in 1980. It's now an established category of identity among non-Hispanics, as well as many with origins in Latin America, along with the term Latino and more recently Latinx. While systemic racism against Black people is all too persistent, immigrants, in Todd Hamilton's phrase, Tom Hamilton being a sociologist who actually teaches at Princeton, are remaking Black America. Now about 10% of Black America 10% of Black Americans are immigrants, and with their children, the figure is about 20%. There's a greater awareness among many Americans, both Black and non-Black, of ethnic or national origin differences within the Black population. And this is especially the case in cities where Black immigrants have become a significant presence. And this includes New York and the Miami areas, the New York and Miami areas have by far the largest proportion of Black immigrants compared to other places in the United States. But we're also talking about places like Minneapolis and Lewiston, Maine, where Africans are highly visible drivers of increases in the overall Black population. And immigration has affected how the white majority sees itself. Although whites of European origin are still associated with privilege in the US and often take their white identity for granted, many whites have become increasingly aware of themselves as one racial group in an increasingly diverse America. Around a fifth of Americans, according to some evidence, have not just become more conscious of their whiteness, but also feel that whites' dominant position is under threat, in part owing to the decline in the proportion of whites, as well as economic, political, and occupational gains of non-white groups. Another domain where immigration has had a huge impact is electoral politics. For one thing, immigrant origin voters have helped transform both the Democratic and Republican electoral coalitions. As late as 1980, more whites in the US identified as Democrats than as Republicans. By 2010, it was the reverse. White Republicans substantially outnumbered white Democrats, which they still do. At the same time, the Democratic Party has increasingly become a party supported by non-whites. By 2019, according to a Pew Research Center national survey, racial minorities made up 40% of registered voters who identified with or leaned toward the Democratic Party. Immigration has been pivotal in these changes, and maybe we'll be able to talk about this later, but they haven't been, of course, the only factor involved, but they have been a very important factor in these changes. On one side, immigration has been critical in the large growth in the share of minority registered voters in the national electorate, from 15 to 30% between 1996 and 2019, and they have trended Democratic. Just to give you some idea, in the last 4 presidential elections, Asian and Hispanic voters, 2/3 or more of Asian and Hispanic voters voted for the Democratic presidential candidate. On the other side, many whites, especially non-college educated whites, have been drawn to the Republican Party and its anti-immigrant and anti-minority appeals, motivated in part by anxiety, fears, and resentments that millions of overwhelmingly non-white newcomers will undermine the basic identity of the nation and marginalize and disadvantage whites. And in the context of these racial fears and resentments, immigration has emerged as a major focus of political debates and campaigns, which is another change in the realm of politics. Overt anti-immigrant rhetoric, not just dog whistles, but overt anti-immigrant rhetoric became a staple in the strategies of many Republican leaders, most notably Donald Trump, who gave it a legitimacy in political discourse at the highest levels as he sought to mobilize his core constituency. Who can forget shithole countries, build the wall chants, or the Chinese virus? In a kind of feedback loop, Trump's core supporters' enthusiastic response to his anti-immigrant discourse led to a further emphasis on it as a way to energize his following. Trump, as some historians say, was the most anti-newcomer president in all American history. But since he's left office, anti-immigrant politics remains alive and well in the Republican Party. A number of elected Republican politicians and right-wing media personalities on Fox News have capitalized on and intensified white resentments, promoting the view that native-born white Americans are deliberately being replaced by immigrants and pro-immigrant Democratic policies in order to reduce whites' political power. On the whole, however, immigration has brought enormous benefits as it has created far-reaching changes, something evident when we look at cities and towns around the country. Immigrants, by their sheer numbers, have provided a lifeline in many cities that were losing population. New York City is a prime example of this. They have provided played a key role in the growth of places like Las Vegas and Orlando that were becoming major metropolitan areas for the first time, and revitalized many far-flung rural communities, slowing population loss and in some cases, actually enabling the population to grow. In many central cities, immigration helped deteriorating neighborhoods make a comeback by lifting population and spurring economic growth. And immigration was a factor, not the only factor, but it was a factor behind the decline in violent crime in urban America from the late 1990s and into the early 2000s. In fact, one sociologist quips that if you want to be safe, move to an immigrant neighborhood. When it comes to the economy, immigration has fostered innovation, fueled growth, and helped to shape the development of whole industries. Immigrants practically invented Silicon Valley. They've had an outsized role in high tech, now one of the national economy's largest components, starting and running major new companies and spearheading innovations in them. I think Google's co-founder, who was born in Russia, Sergey Brin, or Pierre Omidyar, born in France to Iranian migrant parents. In 2018, over half of the 91 US startup companies valued at $1 billion or more had at least one immigrant founder, and more than 80% of these companies employed immigrants in key management or product development roles. Immigrants have spurred the formation of other businesses as well, giving many a new character and pioneering new types of enterprises, among them nail salons, Asian American supermarket chains in New York, West Indian dollar vans that ply the streets of Queens and Brooklyn, offering cheaper services and more convenient services than city buses. Nationwide, 1 in 5 business owners in 2014 were immigrants, and they founded about a quarter of new firms. They've helped any number of service industries grow and flourish, filling essential roles at every occupational level, from picking crops to repairing houses. They've reduced shortages in medical and healthcare professions. 28% of the physicians and surgeons in the US are immigrants, and 16% of the registered nurses in the US are immigrants. And they have filled jobs and driven up demand in a number of low-wage occupations, including child and elder care, because the millions of immigrants themselves use services and consume goods. They've boosted the economy and job growth, including in an array of public service jobs and an array of government jobs, which many of them would have disappeared without immigrants. Have immigrants, and this is a question that is often asked in the literature, have immigrants hurt Native workers? Overall, the consensus, and quite an overwhelming consensus, is they haven't hurt Native workers much at all. Because immigrants increase demand for goods and services, and also because immigrant small firms and startups often generate opportunities for native-born workers, and also because highly educated immigrants boost local productivity, the consensus among economists, and as I said, an overwhelming consensus, is that immigration's adverse effects on US-born workers' wages and employment have taken overall been minimal, not looking at individual companies or enterprises, but looking at the whole picture. It has been minimal. The negative impacts have been minimal. Lastly, immigrants are invigorating and indeed remaking what we think of as our uniquely American culture. The foods we eat, the music we listen to, the books we read, the films we watch. If earlier Jewish and Italian immigrants brought us pizza and bagels, today salsa outsells ketchup and tacos are standard fare. In 2015, Chinese restaurants, and there were 40,000 Chinese restaurants in the US in 2015, outnumbered all the Kentucky Fried Chickens, Burger Kings, and McDonald's combined, and now include a wide range of regional dishes and flavors, whether dining at a high-end restaurant, getting a bite at a fast food chain, or buying groceries at the supermarket. Immigration has added new tastes to our cuisine. Immigration and the second generation are new authors on bestseller lists, like Junot Diaz and Jhumpa Lahiri, both Pulitzer Prize winners of respectively The Brief Wondrous Life of Oscar Wilde and The Namesake. Not only do the immigrant and second generation writers highlight perennial immigrant themes like adjusting to American culture and society, but also contemporary issues such as undocumented status. And the same goes for films and TV programs with immigrant and second generation stars, writers, and producers. Yes, they are still underrepresented, but they are having an impact. Two examples: the award-winning TV comedy series Ugly Betty with its Latino producer and cast, and the star is a US born, but her parents are Honduran immigrants. Or a film like The Big Sick, a romantic comedy focusing on South Asian, actually not arranged marriage, but semi-arranged marriage with a Pakistani-born star and co-writer Kumail Nanjiani. Immigrants in the second generation have taken popular music in new directions. Pop music superstars with roots in Latin America have brought Latin rhythms fused with American popular music to mainstream audiences. One of the best known is Gloria Estefan, Cuban-born and Miami-based. Caribbean immigrants have introduced the sounds of Jamaican reggae, Cuban salsa, Dominican merengue, and they have played a major role in the creation and development of hip hop, which many think was an African-American creation, but actually African-Americans were involved, but it was also an Afro-Caribbean and Latino-Caribbean creation as well. Among the recent rap celebrities are Nicki Minaj, born in Trinidad, and Rihanna from Barbados. At one and the same time, immigrants in the US-born second generation have broadened mainstream American culture while also creating new mixtures that blend aspects of American and immigrant cultures. So immigration, to conclude, has profoundly changed America. Of course, I hope you'll read the book because I've only had a chance to skim and not go into as much detail, complexity, and depth as I do in the book. And also I want to mention that more changes are in store as new arrivals settle in this country and millions of the US-born second generation grow up and enter adulthood. The meaning of racial and ethnic categories, just to mention one example, is likely to change as more children and grandchildren of post-65 immigrants move into the upper ends of the occupational hierarchy, and as the proportion of mixed marriages and multiracial children grows. We'll see changes in other spheres too linked to immigration, including in the world of politics as racial minorities become a larger part of the electorate. Immigration, in short, has been, and no doubt will continue to be a major element in the evolution of American society and culture. Our growth as a nation, the historian Oscar Handlin wrote more than 60 years ago, has been achieved in large measure through the genius and industry of immigrants of every race and from every quarter of the world. Their brains and their brawn helped to build our industries, to develop our commerce, to produce new inventions, and in general, to make us the nation that we now are. The millions of immigrants who arrived since Handlin wrote these words have driven additional and fundamental changes. If there is a final lesson to be learned, it's that understanding these transformations is and should be a key part of our analysis of immigration's enormous impact, as it has served as a building block of the nation and is bound in the years ahead to continue to mold and remold our society in new and sometimes unexpected ways. So those are my introductory remarks or to set out the book. And now, Alan, there you go.
Here we are. Good evening, Nancy, and good evening all. Nancy, first of all, I'd like to congratulate you very much on this wonderful book. I mean, if there was ever a new volume that really deserved an honored place on the shelf of American history in just about every library and study, this is it. Because as you said quite correctly, many historians have addressed the issue of how the individual immigrant is affected by moving from one place to another, but far too few have talked about the issue of how the society has been changed by all the newcomers who have arrived. So I'm going to ask a few questions and maybe kick off our conversation. And then at about 15 minutes of the hour, we'll ask others to join us with some questions. So let me start out with the event that sort of ignited the current wave of immigration, and that was the Hart-Celler bill, the 1965 Immigration Act. How did that act change our system and result in a very different size and diversity of the migration flow to the United States?
the 1965 law really was very critical. I think people, when they look back to the 60s, they think of civil rights movement, women's movement, but actually the change in the laws in immigration was equally important. Or some might say, I was recently at an event where someone said it was more important. I wouldn't argue, I wouldn't strive to make that argument, but it was very, very important in revolutionizing the immigration system. Because the immigration system in 1965, it was one that was shaped by legislation in the 1920s that was designed in the 1920s deliberately to restrict the immigration of Eastern and Southern Europeans who were coming in huge numbers into the country at that time and before that time, between the 1880s and the 1920s. And the 1924 legislation put in place national origins quotas so that each country had a different quota. First of all, to put in numerical limits for the first time, but it also put in a national origins quota. And the 1965 Act abolished the national origins quota. And so that before 1965, for example, immigrants from Asia who were restricted even before the 1920s, long been restricted from immigration, for the first time in 1965, were able to come in large numbers. And this was true from other parts of the world as well, where the countries had been limited to very, very small quotas. So what you had was two things happen. One is that the numbers escalated of immigrants and the source countries changed. So just to give you an idea of the numbers, and I should say that it was not only this restrictive immigration law in the 1920s, but also, of course, there was the Depression and World War II. So that between the 1920s and the mid-1960s, immigration was very low into the United States. Post-1965, in 1960, there were a little under 10 million immigrants in the United States. Today, there are 45 million immigrants. So you can see that in one issue with one change was the numbers, but also the source countries. In 1960, 75% of the immigrants in the US were European. 75%. Now, many of them were older who had come quite a while ago, but that's 75%. Today, 11% of the immigrant population are from Europe. The overwhelming majority of immigrants are from Asia, Latin America, and the Caribbean. I mean, where immigrants are coming from has changed, and the numbers have grown tremendously, in large part, in good part, due to the 1965 legislation. And of course, since 1965, there was subsequent legislation which actually had the effect of expanding immigration. So that we've had, for over 50 years, we've had large-scale immigration coming into this country.
Thanks. I'm also wondering about the unintended consequences that emerged from the 65 Act, and that has to do with undocumented immigrants. If there is one issue that really lights the fire of people who want to argue about immigration, it's the issue of the unauthorized or undocumented newcomers. I was wondering if you could comment on that a little.
Yeah, and let me just say, before I cut to the undocumented, I think it's interesting because the 1965 law is also often cited as a perfect example of the unintended consequences of legislation, because the people passing the bill thought that it was simply going to mean that people from Europe would be, from Southern and Eastern Europe would be able to come here in larger numbers. They thought, well, because one of the things I didn't mention was that the 1964 Act made family reunification the major basis for getting legal immigration status in the US, and to a lesser extent, employment. So with this big emphasis on family reunification, they thought, well, people would just bring their families here, people who already were immigrants. But in fact, it didn't work that way. Now, coming to undocumented immigration, I think we need to mention that as well. I do in the book, but let me just go through it a little bit. First of all, I think we need to know the numbers, because even since 1965, in fact, even since the 1990, the number of undocumented immigrants has grown greatly. In 1990, there were 3.5 million undocumented immigrants. Today, there are 10 to 11 million undocumented immigrants in the US. And to look at it another way, that means 1 out of 4 immigrants in the US is undocumented. That is a very, very high proportion. And of course, immigrants who have no rights, right, who are, because they are undocumented, they are confined very often mostly to the worst jobs. They have access to virtually no social security and social welfare benefits in the US. And this is a real problem for our society. And in addition, just to give you another fact that maybe you don't know, but I think is important to appreciate, is that of these 10 to 11 million undocumented immigrants in the US, 2/3 of the undocumented immigrant adults have been living here 10 years or more. So not only do we have this high undocumented population, which lacks basic rights, and people they're working. I mean, they have to work because they don't get access to any other kinds of benefits, and who fear deportation. That these immigrants are long settled. They've been living here for a long time, and many of them have mixed status families. So what does that mean? It means they may have, if they have children here, their children are US citizens by birth. They may have relatives or close relatives living with them who have lawful permanent resident status. And a study in New York a number of years ago made clear that undocumented parents were often frightened of going to apply for benefits for which their US-born citizen children were eligible. So, this is a big problem for our country. It's certainly, when we're talking about the economy, it's relevant as well, because undocumented immigrants are among those who are doing work that other Americans don't want to do, and who lack benefits, who are often doing dangerous and risky jobs.
The material you offered us on the amount of innovation that's undertaken by immigrants to the United States is very, very striking. And this is sort of a two-part question. And one is, does this have something to do with the degree of education, especially higher education, that many of today's immigrants have that earlier waves did not have? And second, what's the underlying reason? Have you speculated about why immigrants are so innovative and creative and energetic when it comes to starting new things?
Well, one has to do, and that has to do with the high levels of education of a very large segment of the immigration population today. And as Alan mentioned, this is very different from a century ago, when most immigrants had very, very little education, and sometimes no education at all. Many were not even literate. Today, 1/3 of the immigrants in the United States have a college degree or more. 1/3, that's really high. Now, at the other end, about 26% don't even have a high school diploma. But for the moment, let's focus on those who have a BA or higher. So the U.S. we're getting a lot of very highly educated immigrants. Some, by the way, who initially even came here as students and then completed their college education and beyond and stayed. So we are benefiting from having a lot of professional immigrants who unfortunately sometimes can't even carry out their professions here because they don't have licensing requirements. But that is one reason for the innovations. But the other is that immigrants are a very highly selected group. And what does that mean? It doesn't just refer to that they have a BA or more, such a large percentage have a BA or more. It also refers to the fact that, considering those in the countries of origins from which they come, they are among the more educated, even if they don't have a high school diploma. Even they may have more education than the average person in their country of origin. Moving here, it's not so easy to move here, to uproot yourself, to leave your country, to come to another one. They're ambitious. They are very highly motivated to do well, partly to help their relatives at home. But I think something that I find in my teaching, actually, at CUNY, their parents the immigrants themselves are very highly motivated to do well so that their children will do better. And they are willing, they struggle, they make all these sacrifices, and they want their children to do better, and therefore they are ambitious. Now, if we look at some of I mentioned figures on the starting businesses, and one reason many immigrants start businesses is because they do have some education, but they lack English. They aren't able to, they may have some kind of profession, but they aren't able to practice it here because they can't pass licensing exams, which are often in, English. They may not know English. They come here often in the Middle Ages, it sounds like the Middle Ages, but in middle age, when, it's hard to get a job, and make contacts. They don't have networks here that will help them. And so that many of them, those immigrants are often more likely, those who have mobility, whose mobility is constrained, often say instead of doing a menial job, they will try to start businesses, and often they have some capital that they bring with them that enables them to do that. And I think that's one of the reasons why many immigrants, this high percentage of immigrants do start businesses, because, and of course, many immigrants, the other factor is that lawful permanent residents, even in the first 5 years that they're here, don't have access to benefits, social welfare benefits. So they have to get out there and work. But I think that, those are some of the reasons why we see immigrants making innovations and boosting our economy.
I'm wondering also how this affects politics.
Mm.
And in earlier generations, many of the immigrants who came to the United States, at least in the first generation, those who came from Southern and Eastern Europe, were radicals. They came and they wanted to make the revolution. Of course, many of them ended up voting for Roosevelt in the 1930s, and they didn't make the revolution. But I'm wondering about the politics of today's immigrants. And given the high levels of education that you've described, do they tend to be more conservative in their political views than perhaps immigrants of an earlier generation?
I don't know about comparing them to the earlier generations on politics. I mean, what we do know from studies of immigrants, immigrants and second generation, remember, because many immigrants have to naturalize to vote. Now, many do naturalize, but we also have to look at the impact of immigrants on politics in terms of their children too, who are born here. Immigrants may not be radicals. I don't think they are mostly radicals, and in fact, probably in the past, most of them weren't radicals either, although they were coming to America at a time when labor unions were just forming, right? So they didn't come into a society in 1900 where they went to work and there was a labor union that they could join. They started, especially Jewish immigrants, but Italian immigrants too, if we're looking at New York, they were very active in forming labor unions. Today, immigrants actually are involved in forming labor unions, or increasing the membership of unions in certain service industries. For example, there was a famous janitor strike in Los Angeles that involved immigrants, and they're involved in some taxi workers in the association to organize. But most immigrants who are in labor unions are in labor unions because they work in places where there are already labor unions. I mean, the classic one example being in New York City, where health workers, workers in hospitals and nursing homes, there are high proportions of immigrant workers in those fields, but they come in already to a place where there is a union. So that's a difference. But I think we still should keep in mind, I mean, as I said, the immigrants do trend democratic. I know there's a lot of, in the newspapers, there's a lot of discussion about Hispanics becoming, voting for Trump. And yes, more Hispanic in 2020, Trump got 10% more of the Hispanic vote than he did in 2016. And there is a concern in the Democratic Party, obviously, that there may be more of Hispanics and Asians may vote Republican. But at least so far, as I said, there have been differences in the presidential elections, and they do so far have voted heavily Democratic. So they do tend to be more liberal. We don't know what will happen in the future. I mean, that's an issue. We don't know what will happen in the future. I mean, look, for example, at Italians as one example. they were very liberal, right, when they as immigrants, but they became much more conservative over time. And that may happen to many immigrants, as well over the generations. As they become more successful economically, they may be more amenable to the Republican Party. An issue for Hispanics are social issues, on abortion, for example. So those, and they also have a kind of, pull yourself up by your own bootstraps kind of mentality that may find the Republican Party more appealing at times. So, I mean, those are factors. We don't know exactly how immigrants and their children are going to vote in the future, but at least for now, they do trend largely Democrat.
Yeah, in an earlier generation, many immigrants did not apply for citizenship because it involved studying, taking a test. They didn't have time for this in their lives as they tried to eke out a living and raise their families and so on. What about the rates of citizenship these days? Are immigrants pursuing citizenship?
Well, yeah. Well, some groups have higher levels than others. Asian immigrants, for example, have very high levels of citizenship. Mexicans have had traditionally lower rates, and some say that that's because they go back and forth. They aren't committed as much to staying here as Asian immigrants. The rates vary. There have been a number of studies which have compared naturalization rates in the US with Canada, which has much higher rates. And one reason that Canada has much higher rates is that it's much more proactive in getting people to become citizens. Here, when the Democrats are in power, they encourage citizenship. When the Republicans are in power nationally and have an ability, they tend to discourage it. In fact, under Trump, they really raised the rates tremendously. They made it much more difficult. They cut back on the staff and made it more difficult for immigrants. They really don't want immigrants to become citizens, I would say, because that would lead to more Democratic votes. But I think the longer immigrants are here, the more likely on the whole they're to apply for citizenship. And the other factor, interestingly, that's found is today we have something that was not available 100 years ago, which is that many immigrants have the ability to be dual citizens. And that depends not on what the United States does. We kind of look the other way and informally tolerate dual citizenship. It's really what the country of origin does, whether they allow dual citizenship. And what we've seen in the last 10, 15 years is country after country legislating dual citizenship. Partly, I think it's because they want to continue having remittances being sent from here. They want to keep the loyalty of their immigrants who left and came to the U.S. But one consequence of dual citizenship is to not make it an all or nothing proposition. You don't have to give up citizenship in your home country to become a U.S. citizen. And so I think that's, and interestingly, in many cases, or in some cases, immigrants who are dual citizenship actually can vote in home country elections. But so far, what we've seen is that the rates of participating in home country elections is actually very low, very low. Yeah. And of course, on the other end, I don't know how many of you have been following this, but New York City has taken the step just recently of allowing non-citizens to vote, which is not the case in other cities in the country. And that's only in citywide elections. It will not be, you have to be a citizen to vote in federal and state elections, but in New York City elections. And that is going to mean, they say, at least in the newspapers that I read, another 800,000 people become eligible to vote in New York City elections. And if we're talking about the impact of immigrants, that will have an impact on citywide elections.
I know many people are sending in questions, but I have one last question, and that is, how has COVID affected immigrants and their influence in the U.S.?
Well, I mean, it's affected immigrants in a very big way because many immigrants work in places with direct contact with the public. So during the pandemic, they were in essential frontline services. They were the ones caring for patients in nursing homes. They were the ones in the meat processing factories, which had very high rates of COVID. They were working in supermarkets and the counters. So they had a high rate of getting COVID. That's for one thing. And also small businesses. Many of them were working in sectors that were very hard hit hotels, construction, retail, restaurants. A lot of immigrant restaurants went under. Now, the question is, how much that those businesses will come back, or people will found new ones. And I also should add that undocumented immigrants not eligible for health care, they're not eligible for, except for emergency Medicaid, worried about accessing services during the pandemic. It was really difficult. And some of the government benefits, undocumented, were not eligible for those that were put in place during the pandemic. And so the pandemic has been very difficult and hurt many immigrants. And I see this, by the way, in my own classes, of the students in my classes whose parents have really struggled. So many of them and their families had COVID. And I should say also, another factor is that many of them, because they have low incomes, are living in very crowded quarters, which also was a big problem during the pandemic.
Thanks, Nancy. Perhaps we could go to some of the questions. Madeline, have you been compiling questions?
Yes, I'm going to read them in the order they came in. We have 4. We'll do our best to get to all of them if we have time. So the first question is, could you provide any comparison between the US and Canada or the US and Europe with regard to the percentage of immigrants that are undocumented?
I don't know about, I would suspect that in Canada, it's much lower. They don't share a 2,000-mile border with Mexico. That's a big reason, okay? I mean, they share the border with us, but I don't think there are so many undocumented immigrants flowing into Canada from the US. In fact, if anything, it would be the other way around. But the main border where there's crossing the border is with Mexico. Although, again, let me just add one other factor. Nearly half of the undocumented immigrants don't cross any border. They come with a tourist visa or some other kind of temporary visa, and they overstay the terms of the visa. So we should keep that in mind too. Europe has a far fewer undocumented immigrants as well than the United States. The United States has a large number, and I think it's also has a lot to do with the fact that we're right next to a source of a country with over 100 million people who many of them want to migrate here, and also I should say that that there's a big backlogs from Mexico. People who try to come legally, but one may not have a relative here who can sponsor them. And there are very, very long backlogs, from Mexico for certain categories of family members. You don't want to wait 15 years before you can get here. So I think that's one difference. Yeah.
Thank you. The next question says, given all of the positive impacts of immigration that are outlined in your book, how can a society justify having limits on immigration?
Well, it can. I mean, every country. I mean, I don't think there's any country that has unlimited immigration. I think that countries have borders and they control who enters them. It was easier 100 years ago when you can only get here by boat, from Europe. And even then, there were inspections to get on the boat. That's how they regulated it, and not here so much as getting on the boat. And yes, I don't think countries feel they need to justify it. I think it's the norm internationally that countries have limits on or set who can enter and who cannot. I don't know if that answers the question, but
yeah, I would add something to that, and that is that every country has a limits on resources, on in some cases land and just basic space. And so throughout history, countries have policed their borders, established borders, stuck by them, and what we're doing today and other countries are doing today is simply an extension of what countries have always done, and that is to protect their own populations from competing unfairly, perhaps, or fairly, with newcomers who challenge those limited resources.
I think it's interesting because as an academic, and in the immigration field, there's a lot of discussion, particularly among political philosophers, or about open borders. Should we have open borders? And, you know, on a philosophical level, it's an interesting discussion, but on a practical level, it's not going to happen. I sometimes think, I mean, we are, so the question really is, given that we're going to have borders and we're going to have limits on who comes here, the question is, well, what kind and how, you know, do we construct in our immigration system? And, you know, how do we deal with, which is, of course, a big issue on everybody's minds and on our minds today, what do we do about humanitarian immigration? The United States has not really been very good on humanitarian immigration. We don't take in very many immigrants, refugees. Yeah.
Thank you. So we've got three more. Do we know what percentage approximately of today's first generation immigrants are indeed entrepreneurs in the United States?
Well, I gave you the figure about businesses. What is it? 1 out of 4 immigrants owns an immigrant business. So that would be the figure that I would give you. You know, I think, you know, how many business owners are immigrants? That's the figure. About a quarter of businesses are owned by immigrants. Now, some of them are very tiny businesses, but they're businesses. So that's the figure.
Great, thank you. How should we understand immigrant as a category of identity as it intersects with other categories immigrants might use to categorize themselves, class, race, etc.?
That's a good question. Obviously, that I don't know how. It's an interesting question, actually, because I think if you ask people, I'm not sure who are immigrants. I'm not sure they would say immigrant was even the first way they would classify themselves. I think, especially in the United States, they might classify them in terms of country of origin. They would say, I'm Mexican or I'm Jamaican. They wouldn't say, I'm a Jamaican immigrant. In fact, they wouldn't say that. They would just say, I'm a Jamaican or I'm Mexican. They might use what we would call a pan-ethnic category and say, I'm Hispanic or Latino, right? Or I don't think they would say I'm Asian, because the pan-Asian category, the Asian groups are so different in so many very strong ways that I think they would say I'm Chinese or I'm Indian. They may use another, I think some groups, Black immigrants, they may say they're Jamaican, but maybe they might, some people might say I'm Black. I don't know. I mean, you'd have to do a study to see that. But I think national origin / you know, ethnic racial identification is much stronger than identifying as an immigrant. I only think in some situations would they identify as an immigrant. You know, people have different identities, right? So they identify in some ways in some groups and in other situations, and they identify in other ways in other situations. And there may be some situations where immigrant would be a primary identity and they would say, I'm an immigrant. I don't know if they would say in a naturalization ceremony, you know, some setting where immigration or immigrant status was an important one. But I don't think that's a primary identity. It doesn't mean that their immigration status isn't important, because that's two things, right? One is how people identify and see themselves. And then the other, of course, whether to it, is how others see them, right? And how, and in some, many other people may see them as immigrant. They hear a different language, right? They see a person and say, well, he's an immigrant, or she's an immigrant, but that may not be how the person defines themselves.
Yeah, a lot of it also has to do with one's inner feelings about the status that one has in moving from place to place and the circumstances of the move. I'm thinking of a very famous essay called Refugee by the philosopher Hannah Arendt, who came to the United States fleeing the Nazis, and wrote this essay about what it meant to her to be a refugee, how that felt to her, what it meant to be an outsider and the way that she felt as an outsider. So if you're looking for something introspective about people who are on the move, that essay goes a long way toward talking about those inner feelings.
Yeah. I think in some situations people might identify as refugees. Yeah. But I still think they think in national origin terms. It's I teach at Hunter College, and I teach a course on migration to a total of about 90 students, and almost every single one of them is an immigrant or a children of immigrants. And I hear the way they talk, and they refer to themselves, even when they are refugees or their parents were refugees, they tend not to use that term. But I agree with Alan. I think there certainly are circumstances where they may. particularly since refugees get certain benefits because they're refugees, and that makes them much more. And also, actually, a student of mine who wrote a dissertation on Liberian refugees said that among the Liberians, they felt refugee was a negative. It was interesting. They didn't like being called refugees. Yeah, which is interesting. Yeah.
Well, that the last question actually relates to the question of refugees from Ukraine. So I'm going to read it aloud, and when you two are done, I will just hop on screen very briefly with some closing details. So our last question is, do you think the current humanitarian crisis in Ukraine due to the war will create a need to take refugees in the United States or see an influx in immigration from that region?
Well, I think it's going to create a need. The question is, how will it be met? The US, the president and Congress set the number who are admitted, and they have made exceptions. I think Biden is agreeing to take some Ukrainians in as a temporary TPS on a temporary basis. But I don't know what the quota for every year is. What, 125,000 kind of max, and it's very difficult now because under Trump, there were a lot of cutbacks in staff, and the whole processing of refugees is very complicated and takes a very long time. It's done from outside the country. Refugees, that you have to be vetted outside the country. It takes almost a year. So I don't know how the US is going to deal with this and how many they're going to ultimately take. You read in the papers, you see 2 million already are fleeing, right? I mean, they're mostly going to go to Europe. To other, and I don't know what they're going to say either. How many they're going to, want to take. The U.S. will have to take a fair number, but it will be really a drop in the bucket compared to the numbers.
I think a lot of it depends on how the conflict turns out. My sense is that the Ukrainians who are fleeing want to live in Ukraine. And they don't see a move to the United States as a permanent thing, perhaps a temporary situation. On the other hand, should the Russians take over Ukraine and unseat the government that's there, then yes, there could be a permanent long-term refugee issue that the United States and other host countries would really have to look at and debate in terms of how that flow would be divided up and agreed upon.
And it's going to mostly be to Europe, which already had, I mean, with the Syrian refugees, after all, Europe, Germany took over 1 million in 2015, and it was a problem politically for Angela Merkel. And so, it's got a lot of issues involved. So we'll have to, as Alan said, we have to see, first of all, what happens in Ukraine. And then second of all, what the U.S. is, if we're talking from the U.S. perspective, of what the U.S. is willing to do. Yeah.
Well, I think that is all we have time for tonight. So thank you so much to our speakers, Nancy Foner and Alan M. Kraut, for joining us and for this enriching conversation. I put some links in the chat for places that you can find the book, 1/4 of the Nation. It was a pleasure to host all of you in the audience tonight, and I appreciate your flexibility as we hopped over from Crowdcast to Zoom. I did put a link in the chat to a very brief survey. If you'd be willing to fill it out, we'd be grateful for your feedback. We're always interested in hearing your thoughts on our programs. And otherwise, you can check out the library's events calendar to see other author talks and presentations and programs that we have coming up. And we hope to see you soon. So thank you so much to our fabulous speakers and our audience, and have a wonderful night.
Thanks very much.
Yeah, thank you, Madeline.
Good night, all.
Good night.